Welcome, everybody. Cheers. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Preemptuous. You know, I think most of us know people that are always looking over the horizon, looking for the next thing, thinking about where the grass is greener, where the ocean is bluer. And I think about those people and their ornithological equivalents a lot at this time of year. If you went out late at night and put your ear to the sky, you might not hear them. They might be too high up, but they're there right this time of year and beginning. Billions of birds migrating through the darkness to some place that many of them have never been before. I often think about that this time of year. Now, a lot of our birds migrate at night, and a lot of our shorebirds actually migrate during the day, but some of the birds that I have tracked and put GPS tags on over the years also fly at night, including some of those shorebirds. And I think about that this time of year because some of the birds that I've put, upland sandpipers, for example, that I've put GPS tags on, have flown during migration for 3 or 4 days continuously, nonstop. Night and day, 30, 40 miles an hour, many of them over the open ocean, no land for 4 days. And I especially think about that in fall when juvenile birds, birds born that summer, are migrating for the first time to a place they've never seen before. They don't know what's there. It's a promise. You might argue to me that it's evolutionary hardwired, and I'm an evolutionary biologist by training, so I tend to support that. But still, that's an incredible feat for someone to tell you, yeah, just fly that way for 4 days and you'll be there. And on a northward journey, many of these birds make incredible distances and legs back. There are some Herculean efforts in the world of shorebird migration that we will hear about tonight. Birds that travel basically from pole to pole and back, traveling 40,000 kilometers in a given year. Spoon-billed sandpipers in Asia, and pectoral sandpipers, and Hudson and bar-tailed godwits. And you're going to hear a lot about those species tonight. And my name is Jason Hill, and I'm a conservation biologist at a local nonprofit here called Vermont Center for Eco Studies. And once a month between November and May, we bring you Suds in Science. Did you know that's what this is, Suds in Science? Right, yeah. And every month we give you an opportunity to interact and engage with experts in their field. And tonight you're going to hear from an expert in his field. He's going to tell you, Dr. Stephen Brown is going to tell you about his work with shorebird conservation over the decades and tracking some of these birds, where they go, how we figure that out, the network of lands that are being conserved along the way to help protect them. I hope that you'll interact and ask questions throughout the talk. There'll be time for questions at the end of the talk, but please, during the talk, reach out as well. And with that, how about a big Suds in Science welcome for Dr. Stephen Brown.
Thanks very much, Jason, and thanks, Chris, for inviting me tonight. It's really a pleasure to be here. Chris and I share a mentor from my home institution, Manomet, and it's really a pleasure to come up and share a little bit about our work and visit with you all. And thanks very much to all of you for coming out tonight. I know it's a rainy spring evening, but I appreciate your coming out, and I hope that by the end of the evening you'll share some of my love and appreciation for shorebirds and some of the miraculous things that they do. So when I first saw a grizzly bear in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, it was about a mile away, and it was coming down a stream that I was coming up, and I was by myself, which is not how I'd recommend you arrange your first visit to an Arctic grizzly bear. I thought back to my training. I was a new Arctic biologist. This was in 2000, the first time I'd been in the Arctic. So I thought back to the training I had a whole week before about what do you do when you encounter a grizzly bear. And the first rule is leave the area undetected if possible. So I thought, well, I'll back slowly up this hill and get out of the drainage that this grizzly bear is working his way down. I was working my way up looking for shorebirds, and I thought I'll just very, very calmly, not run away as I was trained, back up the hill and leave him to explore this particular river valley. So as he started coming down, I was working my way up the hill, and just as I was about to disappear over the hill, he locked eyes with me. And I'll never forget the feeling of being prey that I had at that moment. It was very clear to me. He was about a quarter of a mile away and took off at a dead run to come and have me for dinner. So as he's coming up the hill, I'm getting ready to use a cracker shell, which is a tiny little shotgun shell that has something like a firecracker in it, and the idea is to shoot it and scare the bear. As he's running up the hill toward me, I remember thinking very clearly, what is a Vermont farm boy doing standing in the Arctic facing down a grizzly bear by himself? So tonight I'm going to tell you the story of why I was there, how I got there, what we've been doing in the Arctic, what the birds are doing when they go to the Arctic, and share with you some of the stories of the work that we've done as we've tried to understand the mysteries of their migration and to piece together a conservation strategy to try to protect them from the many threats that they're facing.
So did you live? Yes.
So I lived. And I'll get back to the end of that story in a little bit. But in the meantime, I wanted to start by just telling you a little bit about what is a shorebird. A shorebird is a taxonomic group of birds. So if you're familiar with them, great. If you're not, they're things like sandpipers and plovers. If you've been to the beach, you're familiar with sanderlings that run up and down with the waves. They're the kind of stereotypical shorebird that you'll see running up and down as the waves come in and out on Cape Cod or places like that. There are a lot of other kinds of shorebirds. They don't all use shoreline habitats. A lot of them use other kinds of wetlands. There are even some interior shorebirds. So it's a diverse group of species, but some of the things they have in common are being adapted for very fast flight. Most of them have very long migrations, so they have long pointy wings. They're adapted to cover very long distances in their migration. And some winter in the farthest southern tip of South America and Tierra del Fuego and make their way every year all the way to the northern part of the Arctic and back again every year. So some of them cover the entire length of the hemisphere. So one of the species that I'm going to talk a little bit about tonight is the semi-palmated sandpiper. And that's a bird you can find in many places around Vermont. They're common in mudflats, anywhere that there's exposed mud, things like on a riverbank. They're common in places like the Dead Creek Wildlife Management Area, over at Herrick's Cove, places where they have the right kinds of habitats. And the semi-palmated sandpiper is one of the birds that's declining very dramatically. There was work done on their wintering grounds in South America, and back in the 80s, there were a couple of million of them found in this stretch along the sort of northwest coast of South America, so French Guiana, Suriname, that region, all the way around to Brazil. When that work was repeated about 20 years ago by some colleagues at New Jersey Audubon Society and some colleagues from the Canadian Wildlife Service, the population had declined by about 80% in those areas, which we believe are the core of the wintering range. So very dramatic declines in a species, and then the question, of course, becomes why, and that's what we need to understand if we're going to have effective conservation. So the semi-palmated sandpiper is one good example of a bird that you could see here that could be on its way, coming and going. So before I go, I'll take you on a bit of a journey to the Arctic and tell you about some of the things that we've been doing there, but I wanted to tell you a little bit about the other parts of our conservation work. So Jason mentioned that we've established a network of conservation sites. It's called the Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network, which goes by the acronym WISRN, which I'm fond of saying is the second worst acronym in the conservation world. My personal candidate for the absolutely worst acronym is EASRN, which is the East Asian Australasian Shorebird Reserve Network. They've one-upped us in the bad acronym category, but it tells the story. It's the Western Hemisphere, and it's a network of reserves. So one of the things that's unusual about shorebirds is that they concentrate at migration stopover sites. So you can be in a place and have a large proportion of the entire species in a small area, and that makes them very vulnerable to things like disturbance, things like oil spills, impacts to the habitat, loss of those kinds of critical habitats, and of course loss of coastal wetlands is rampant, and so there's a lot of habitat loss for places that they use. That makes a special kind of challenge, and in the 1980s, some very visionary colleagues put together the idea of having the Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network, and some of them were from Manomet and some other institutions that work together. They came up with the idea of linking together all of these critical places, like links in a chain, and that was the metaphor was, if a shorebird needs to stop at one of its migration stopover sites, and then go on to the next, and then on to the next, to eventually find its way to South America. If any one of those links in the chain is missing, then the migration is over. The birds die and can't complete their trip. So we need to look at a scale that was really quite revolutionary back then. This was in 1980, so remember, no email. So you would write a letter and put it in the mail to someone you'd never met in Chile and say, gee, wouldn't you like to coordinate with us on shorebird conservation? But these folks were foresighted enough to build that network, and of course, now we can collaborate with all of those people much more effectively. And we just came back from a major meeting with many of our colleagues in South America about how to identify and protect some of these critical sites. So Manomet, where I work, supervises the executive office of this network called the Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network. And we do a lot of other work, like trainings to try to help people at those local sites be well prepared to manage for shorebirds and to take care of them while they're there. We also work with local communities there at this network of sites. There are now 101 wizard sites throughout the entire Western Hemisphere, and they're now in 15 countries. So gradually we're building this network of all of these people who've agreed to try to manage and take care of these species. So one of the things that we do is try to understand the biology of the birds, and that's what takes us to the Arctic. So there's a lot of easier places to work than in the Arctic, as you can all imagine. So why do we go there? If you think about most of the bird studies that people do, they're very often interested in the breeding areas. And for a couple of good reasons. That's where you can figure out whether they're breeding successfully. But it's also the only place in the life of a shorebird where you can find the same bird again. So think about a bird that's nesting in the remote Arctic tundra. You might see it here in Vermont. Someone might see it on the coast of Georgia. Someone might see it in South America. But try to find that single bird again, and you'll have a long search. So in the Arctic, we can study birds, and as Jason mentioned, we can use tracking mechanisms like GPS, and I'll tell you a little bit about some of the Geo Locator work. I wanted to show you a couple of pictures of just what it can be like to work in the Arctic. So we'll start our journey with just a couple of pictures of Arctic habitats, and I'll hand this around. This is a picture by Shubhankar Banerjee, who wrote a book called Seasons of Life and Land, and got me involved in the process of trying to do outreach on bird conservation. And I'll pass this around. That's one of my favorite pictures, and that shows you just a glimpse of the beauty of the Arctic tundra. They're large, vast, open grassland landscapes interspersed with places like this, this is a riparian system where you'd find a whole different set of birds, like ruddy turnstones would be nesting along in this area. So these are really beautiful, stunning landscapes, but they're also very remote and difficult to get to. So the first time I went to the Arctic, we flew in with a beaver. It's a kind of airplane that's really built for Alaska. It's tough, carries a lot of gear, and it can fly really slow, which is very important when you're trying to land somewhere that an airplane has never landed. So the very first time we went in, we worked with our pilot to pick out 4 different campsites that we might be able to land on a frozen lake and get our gear and our crew near to where we needed to be so we could find the birds and start our studies. At each of the first 3 sites, we did what you're supposed to do. The plane comes down and does this very slow flight and does a touch and go, where you just touch the wheels onto the frozen lake to see if it's really frozen. And if it is, you think about coming around again and making a landing. So we checked out 3 of those sites, and to this day I don't know why. But at the 4th site, the pilot decided, it's getting a little late in the day, this is it, we're putting you down here, and he landed the plane on what was supposed to be a frozen lake. It turned out the lake wasn't quite so frozen, and this is a shot of the plane after it came to a stop. What I most remember was, as we settled into the slush, which was about 8 inches deep, because the Arctic had been warming more than was expected of it at the time, the entire plane disappeared in a spray of water. So that inside the plane, we were soaked by water splashing in through the doors. And that was the second time I thought, maybe a Vermont farm boy really shouldn't be touring in the Arctic. As we pulled to a stop, you can see in this, I'll hand it around, that there was about 8 inches of slush. But the nice thing about Arctic lakes is that they freeze completely solid. So if you're used to a frozen lake in Vermont, as I was, your first thought is, we're going to fall through the ice here. And that's what I was thinking as we were sitting there. And then I remembered, oh, no, this is Alaska. it's so cold there that the lakes freeze all the way to the bottom and they melt from the top down. So we were lucky enough that as we pulled to a stop, we weren't about to disappear into the ice. The pilot looked at me as we were sitting there dripping and said, "Bummer, dude." By which he meant, I'm not landing my plane here ever again. Which was unfortunate because the other half of the crew was waiting for him to come and get them. So it took us days to rearrange things, find new sites, call in coordinates. But we eventually got everybody in and were able to do the study. And that was the first time anybody had ever surveyed shorebirds across the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge coastal plain. And that's the area that's been very much in the news. 95% of the coastal plain of Alaska was in a status where it was available for oil and gas development. The 5% that wasn't is the 1002 area of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. So in Alaska, we describe everything by the size of some other state. So the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge is the same size as South Carolina. My favorite Alaska joke is when Alaska became a state, Texas was very upset that they were no longer the biggest state in the Union. So Alaskans, being kindly people, offered to break Alaska into two so that it could be the first and the second largest state, and then Texas could be happy with third. Didn't go over too well in Texas. So the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge is the size of South Carolina, but the piece that's under all of the discussion is just the coastal plain, and that's only the size of Delaware. So there's this area about the size of Delaware that we set out to survey. And after we were able to set up our camp and get our crew in, we did survey the entire 1002 area. It was the first time that that had ever been done. We were able to document the numbers of birds. There are so many birds nesting there that it qualifies as a site of international importance under the rules set up for the Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network. So we were able to establish that it really is an important place, particularly for some species. So after we finished that project, we thought, here are all these birds nesting in the Arctic Refuge. When their chicks hatch, they do one of the most amazing things to me about shorebirds, which is the adults will brood them for a little while, which is, you know, the chicks will gather and the adult will help them stay warm. It's the Arctic after all, so they need a little help getting going. But these are what we call precocial chicks, which means they pretty much come out of the egg ready to run away. And they, within a very short period of time, can...
Just a little bit.
Sure, sorry, I'll do my best. It's a big room. So the chicks hatch out of their eggs and in a very short time are ready to leave the nest, which is important because they're ground nesters. So, you know, all sorts of predators are looking for them and trying to eat them all the time. So those precocial chicks can very quickly leave the nest. The adults will help take care of them for a little while, but then they leave. They're under immense selective pressure to get out of the Arctic. The weather can change at any time. There can be bad storms. There are a lot of predators. So the adults get ready to go and head south. The young birds then are left on the tundra to figure out their way. And as Jason said earlier, their task then, if you will, is to fly to South America, which is a place they've never been, and there's no one to show them the way. And that, to me, is the single most remarkable thing about what these creatures do. So we started thinking about what risks do these juvenile birds face as they get ready to do that. And nobody really even knew where they went. So we decided that the coastal mudflats were the most likely habitats. And we set out to do a survey of the entire coastline of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge in this boat. This is a little rubber boat, and if you think it's really crazy to set out across the Arctic Ocean in a little rubber boat, you're exactly right. It wasn't a great idea. So we surveyed about 138 miles of coastline. That would be like leaving here and going to Montreal, for example, or to Plymouth, Massachusetts. So it's a long way in a little tiny rubber boat. And as we started out, we were dodging around floating ice because it's the Arctic Ocean. And as we found our way down, it is after all the Arctic, and this is a picture of our captain, Steve Kendall, being very stalwart as we were boating along in the Arctic Ocean while it was driving snow in our face. So it was a challenging project. It took us actually 4 years of survey work to get what we thought was an adequate understanding of the habitats that were being used all along this coast. Very intricate, bays and river mouths and a lot of different estuaries. Very difficult to access, soft mud, it's easy to get stuck. We often had to pull each other out as we would get stuck in the very soft sediments. These are rivers that come down out of the Brooks Range, so they're very glacial driven, many of them, and they have very fine sediment. And that becomes important because those fine sediments then make very rich habitats for the invertebrates, which are the source of food for all these birds. So as we're working our way down along the coast, we saw a lot of scenes like this. These are red-necked phalaropes, and as this comes around, you can see there's a few very close, but as far as you can see, the coast is littered with shorebirds, mile after mile after mile, and that's where you get the sense of these really remarkable numbers of birds. They're not concentrated as they are at migratory stopover sites, but as you think about this endless long stretch of Arctic coastline, you get a sense for the immensity of the populations up there. And these juvenile birds are coming out off of the tundra, and the phalaropes, of course, are in the shallow water, but the young semi-palmated sandpipers are out on the coastal mudflats, and that's where they're feeding. So they're getting ready to fly to South America, to some place they've never been. So how do they do that? So imagine you're a semi-palmated sandpiper. You've been alive for about 4 weeks. And here you are on the Arctic coast. There's a lot of invertebrates. And your job is to basically double your body weight. So for somebody my size, to double my body weight, I would need to eat 1,500 cheeseburgers. So imagine if you could even do that. Say, give yourself a month. So 30 days to eat 1,500 cheeseburgers. You double your weight. And now you're going to set out and run to Mexico. That's what these birds do. It's an extraordinary feat of physiology and adaptation. But they put on double their weight as fat, and that's the fuel that they use to get themselves all the way to South America. So I have a prop to show you. This is a AA battery, something you're very familiar with. But this is the size, this weighs as much as a semi-palmated sandpiper. So imagine the energy that's in this battery. So you could put this in a tiny flashlight and it would run for a few hours. If you put it in a tiny wind-up toy or something, it would run for, I don't know, 20 minutes. The semi-palmated sandpiper weighs this much and yet can pack on enough energy to fly to South America. So think about that as you weigh that. It's a
Before it doubles its weight, or
remarkable, sorry?
is it before it doubles its weight that it's that weight?
That's a kind of a average weight. So it's both sides of that, a little less and then a little more. And it's an average, of course. So the phenomenon, though, is common across many shorebirds that do these long migrations, that they need to double their weight to do these long distance flights. So as they're getting ready to do this, they're out on these coastal mudflats. And the survey that we completed identified the most important ones. And what's really critical about that is that now, of course, as you know, the area's been opened for oil and gas development. So we have the data set that we developed over the last 20 years that we can apply to management of these areas and try to engage in thoughtful use of the development of the resources. It's not entirely clear how that will all go, but we hope that at least with some input into what are the most critical areas and some planning ahead, we can avoid some of the worst impacts to some of those species. When we finished that work, we realized there were some other very large important areas that had never been surveyed. So we, in the next few years, conducted a survey in the National Petroleum Reserve of Alaska, which sounds like a place that's full of oil and gas, but it's actually the largest unspoiled landscape in the United States. It's an enormous area of tundra and mountains on the sort of northwest corner of the whole north of Alaska to the west of the Arctic Refuge. And it's much less well known, but it actually turns out to have the highest density of nesting shorebirds of anywhere on the North Slope. So anywhere in Alaska, the National Petroleum Reserve is the biggest hotspot for shorebirds. So of course, that raises lots of questions. And we've been working with the Bureau of Land Management, who manages that area, in the same way to try to have thoughtful management. There are things that are called special areas that are set aside within it that are intended to be managed more thoughtfully and more carefully for wildlife. After that, we thought the Yukon Delta National Wildlife Refuge was the biggest unknown in Alaska. It's the size of Maine. So you can imagine the daunting task of setting out to survey something the size of Maine. It took us 2 years of survey work, but we eventually finished that survey. And what we found there was that most of the work that had been done was very close to the coast. And so nobody really knew how many shorebirds there were. And one of the reasons that's important is because we use the population estimate of shorebirds for a lot of conservation purposes. So for example, the Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network that I talked about earlier is based on the proportion of the population that use a particular site. So if a site is known to have 1% of the whole population of that species, it qualifies as a regional site and on up for international and hemispheric sites. So you obviously have to know how many birds there are, right? Well, it turns out we really don't. I mean, we have best guesses that are made up of things like high counts from migration sites. So, you know, somebody saw 3,000 birds in this spot at one point. There must have been at least 3,000 birds, right? And if we know at the same time somebody saw thousands of birds at another site, you can start to piece together an inkling of the size of the population. But after we come in and do this kind of carefully planned scientific survey, we often find the population is very much bigger than we thought that it was just from these counts, which is what you'd expect, right? You know we're not catching all the birds when we try to find them on migration. And we found that in the Yukon Delta, so we're just now working on the analysis of some of those data to show really how many birds there are, and then therefore what's the importance of some of these other conservation sites. So that's a big reason that we do that kind of work. After working on those kinds of questions for a while, we started to shift our work more toward the big picture about why shorebirds are declining. And we knew from many data sets, one of them is called the International Shorebird Survey, and it's a citizen science project that was founded before anybody called anything citizen science, but by Brian Harrington, our colleague from Manomet. And he enlisted people all over the hemisphere to basically go out and count shorebirds at a site and report back. And that's been going on since 1972. So we have the longest running data set about shorebird distribution that there is to look back at and say things like, well, what sites are important and how many birds might there be and various things like that. So that survey has allowed us to do an assessment of some of these kinds of important conservation questions. And at the same time, it's showed us declining trends. It wasn't initially designed to be a way to look at trend. And there's lots of problems. It's a volunteer survey, so you go when you want to the site that you picked. And that's challenging from a scientific point of view. Right? We don't have any control over who goes where and when. And that could mean that Chris is at one site on Wednesday and sees a bunch of birds, and I go to another site on Sunday, and maybe it's the same birds, we don't really know. So there's a lot of noise in the data that we have to try to deal with. But it did show dramatic declining trends for many species. So it was enough to sort of act as an early warning system. So we decided that one of the most important ways to try to understand what was happening at the population level was to work at a scale that we had never really thought would be possible, and that was to have simultaneous surveys across the entire Arctic. And obviously that was hugely out of the range of what a tiny organization like Manomet could do. So we built a collaboration called the Arctic Shorebird Demographics Network. And demographics for birds is just like demographics for people. We want to know the vital rates of the birds. So there are things like how many hatch every year, how long do they live, how do the juveniles survive over the year. For a lot of species, juveniles don't survive very well. So we need to know what's getting recruited into the population and then how many birds are dying. But to do that at the scale of the whole Arctic was really daunting. So we got a total of 18 organizations to work with us. If you've ever tried to get 60 people to agree on anything, you can imagine the struggles that we went through to try to get all these organizations to use the same statistical design and the same field techniques and the same approach. But we managed to do 5 years of coordinated surveys. And this is sites, sites where there's a camp. Somebody's going out every day, finding the birds, finding the nests. And finding a shorebird nest in the Arctic is really daunting. So if you're out on the tundra, one of those pictures I showed you, in the square kilometer around you, there's probably 2 nests. So imagine trying to find them. The only time you could even have a remote prayer of finding them is when the birds are displaying. And we think of shorebirds as these very demure little silent creatures that run up and down our shorelines. But when they get to the Arctic, they act just like other birds. They sing beautifully, some of them, and they display. And you can learn their behavior and track them back to the nest. It's still really, really hard because their nest is a cup in the tundra grasses covered with tundra grass. So pretty much you have to see them go to the nest or see them leave the nest to ever find it. But all of this scientific work was based on finding those nests so that we could figure out their nest success. Do they manage to bring off a brood that year? And then we're banding them and looking at their survival rates, and importantly, we're looking at how many return. And that was the key thing we were trying to get at with this study, was what are the survival rates of the birds? So over the course of these 5 years, we collected this enormous data set and are now running models that look at things like survivorship. And one of the early results has been that it looks like most shorebirds are not limited by conditions in the Arctic, with the important caveat that that's the conditions that are there right now. And of course, the Arctic's changing a lot. We'll talk about that a little more in a minute. But right now, the variability in conditions is pretty much what they're adapted to. So we don't find a signal in the Arctic that says, if it's a bad winter, the shorebirds don't survive. What we're finding is the signals pointing toward birds that don't survive to return to the Arctic. And that implies, obviously, a range of conservation responses, like work at the migratory stopover sites in the Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network, and the sites where they're overwintering, particularly in Latin America. So we do a lot of work there with those kinds of challenges, trying to understand what's limiting their survival in the overwintering period. So after we finished working with the Arctic network, we really had the best sense that we've ever had about where to be looking. And it gave us the opportunity to do some other kinds of studies. And one that I want to share with you has to do with using geolocators. So up until that point, most of the work that had been done on birds was from bands. And bands are wonderful, right? I mean, you all know about banding birds. This is a band with an A on it. It's a big one. It's the size of something like a wimbrel. So if you put that on a bird and send the bird off into the world, somebody might see it again and say, hey, I saw A. And they might write you a note or report it to one of the networks where things like that get reported. And if they do, you learn that your bird survived to get from point A to point B, which is great. But it only goes so far, right? You don't know what happened next, and you don't know how it got there. So there's still a lot of questions. So with birds like the semi-palmated sandpiper that we knew were declining dramatically and probably on their migration based on the results of these breeding surveys, we really needed to know a lot more about how they're getting to where they're going. Importantly, how long they take to do it and what sites they use along the way. So this lovely bird was put together by one of my colleagues just to give you a sense of the scale involved. And this is a geolocator. And it's a very special geolocator. It's not only an actual geolocator, it's a geolocator that a bird wore from Coates Island in the Arctic all the way to South America, where it overwintered, and then brought it all the way back to the Arctic, where we could recapture it. And this is the actual unit. So as I pass that around, think about what that shows us. And I just want to briefly show you what we learned from that actual unit when we got it back in the Arctic. So here's Coates Island in Hudson Bay, and I'll pass this around. I know it's far for you guys to see, but big picture, it started in Hudson Bay. It flew down to the coast, and it stopped in Long Island for one day.
Is this a semi?
Yes, this is a semi-palmated sandpiper. Sorry, I should have said that. So it got to Long Island, and I'm really amused that it didn't like Long Island. It stayed there one day and flew to New Jersey. It liked the Jersey Shore a lot better than Long Island. So
How long was the flight from Coates to Long Island?
I have that written down somewhere because I figured somebody would ask. Days, 6 or 7 days. So from here, the bird left New Jersey and flew for 111 hours nonstop to French Guiana. And remember, this is a semi-palmated sandpiper. It can't swim. So it's out here over the open ocean, and we got one fix out in the open. We don't exactly know the route because you get a fix twice a day from these things. So it was going about 25 miles an hour the entire way, and that's when it's using up that fat reserve. If it doesn't have enough fat, it lands in the ocean, and that's the end of its story. But this one made it all the way to French Guiana. It spent 222 days in French Guiana. So we think of these as Arctic shorebirds, but really they're almost like tropical shorebirds, right? It spent 60% of the year on the coast of South America. It flew over to Suriname before heading back, and then it flew again. This distance is about 2,600 miles. Its return journey was about 2,400 miles. And coming back, it averaged about 37 miles an hour because it had a tailwind, which is really important. Some of these birds don't have enough energy to get where they're going without the weather cooperating, and that was a big help. It came ashore in Georgia at some sites where we've just launched a new conservation initiative because there are so many birds using the coast of Georgia. We've just hired a new biologist to work there on coordinating preservation of important areas. And then it went back to Delaware Bay, which is another hotspot for shorebirds, as I'm sure many of you know. Spent a few days there, and then made its way all the way back to Coates Island, where we were lucky enough to find it. And it's because the birds are so site faithful that you have any chance of ever finding them again. So when you're on the ground at the site, you walk for days and days and days and feel like you're just covering an enormous amount of territory, to survey thoroughly in the few square miles around camp. As you get ready to leave and you hop in your plane and you pop up, you say, oh, that's where I walked in that, and then it's gone. And then you fly for 6 hours across similar looking tundra while you're on your way back to, any kind of civilization. And you just get a sense of the vastness of these areas, and in particular how remarkably site faithful they are, that the bird came back to exactly the same place. In some cases, they reused the same nest cup. So they've been to South America for 220 days of overwintering, and they come back and find the same nest cup and reuse it, which just totally blows my mind. So while they're doing these remarkable feats, I hope this gives you a new appreciation of what shorebirds can actually do. This is a picture most people would look at and say, that's a picture of caribou. And we consider them highly migratory, right? This is the porcupine caribou herd. So they're the ones you hear about in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. They're the ones most likely to be disturbed by oil development because that's their calving ground. So they're very much at risk. And there's a lot of interest in how largely migratory they go hundreds of miles around the Brooks Range, and they spend the winter south of the Brooks Range. And what's interesting to me about this is I think the real stars in this picture are these juvenile semi-palmated sandpipers. So they're running around foraging and not paying any attention to the caribou, but they're going to get ready to do one of these really epic migrations to South America, which I just find remarkable. So as I wrap up, we're heading back to Alaska this year. It'll be my 20th season in the Arctic. And we're doing a bunch of different projects. We're going to be working in Northwest Alaska in the national parks. There's a species called the spoonbill sandpiper, which is not found in North America. It's an Asian species. It's also the most endangered shorebird that there is. There's 100 pairs. And they have a really tough time. They nest in Russia. They travel through the Yellow Sea, which is under enormous development pressure. A lot of what's going on there is called reclamation, which means you take the tidal mudflat and you fill it with dirt and make an industrial city. And that's been rampant in this region for several decades, and there's been an enormous loss of intertidal habitat for species like this. They then go to winter in Asia where people eat them, which is hard to get your mind around. They're the same size as a semi-palmated sandpiper, but people are living really on the edge, and finding any little piece of protein helps them get by. So there's a lot of conservation work going on with them. The British Trust for Ornithology is leading it, and they're trying to do things like provide fishing gear so that local people can go and be fishermen. It's much better for them. They are much healthier and do much better being fishermen, but they didn't have any fishing gear, so that wasn't available to them. So they were netting shorebirds and barely squeaking by, trying to eat these tiny birds. So programs like that I find very hopeful, and they're making a lot of progress. They've actually encouraged China to change its policy, and they've announced now that they're going to stop doing these vast industrial reclamation projects. So that's very hopeful. There's some thought that some of these birds might occur in Alaska, and that's why we're going. The National Park Service asked the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to do a survey to see if any of the habitats that are similar to what they nest in Russia that occur in Alaska might have birds. So somebody did a landscape analysis and looked at the maps and said, oh, look at that. This kind of habitat, a special kind of tundra, occurs all over the national parks in Alaska. So we don't expect to find any. But what we do expect is that we will have survey results from these places that have never been surveyed, which is how we've been able to piece together all this work. There's always another purpose, and in this case, it's looking for spoonbill sandpipers. So we'll be doing that, and at the same time, we'll be doing some even more cutting-edge tracking work. The Geo Locator that's going around is remarkable. It tells you where you are by knowing whether it's light or dark out. So it's a very simple piece of technology, and really all it knows is what time is it, and is there light shining on me or not. And it records that every minute forever until you get it back. And from that you can calculate your position uniquely on the Earth. You can use the time of sunset and the length of the day to calculate your position uniquely. But it's not very accurate, and the reason is because twilight is kind of a gradual thing, right? So the unit's like, it's light, it's light, it's light, it's kind of light, it's kind of light, it's kind of light, it's not very light at all. And then eventually it says it's dark, and so you have to do your best to extrapolate the actual sunset and the actual length of day from this sort of curve. So you end up with an accuracy of tens of kilometers, which is awesome if we were doing something like, what country does a semi-palmated sandpiper go to? But if you want to know what sites does it use when it gets there, and what kinds of habitats does it prefer, and what threats there might be at this local spot that it's using, you need something much more accurate. So what we're launching this summer is using a newer kind of satellite technology where the tiny solar cell on the tiny little receiver lets the unit run, and it lets it report its location to a satellite, which is a remarkable achievement, right? These things have been around for a long time, but they're the size of something you'd put on a caribou or a polar bear or something really large. And they've been gradually getting smaller and smaller, so people are using them on birds now, and geese, and they're getting smaller and smaller. So they're finally at the stage where we can use some of them on things like buff-breasted sandpipers, which is another species of conservation concerns. We'll be working on them and on golden plovers this summer. And we're really excited because we'll learn a lot more about their habitat use, but particularly the habitats that they use as they start their southward migration. And that's a big question mark for many of them. We don't really know what habitat preferences they have in the ways we found the semis on the shore, so we know where they go. We don't know the answers to those questions for things like buff-breasted sandpipers that use these tundra habitats. So we're really excited at what we can learn coming up from some of these other techniques. As we're there, we're continuing to try to avoid grizzly bears and polar bears and crashed planes and other kinds of things like that. The people say that polar bears will hunt people, and we were trained to always be really scared of polar bears and really cautious. The polar bears that I've encountered are mostly sleeping. And what's happening is, as I'm sure you've read about, they're coming ashore because the ice is melting. When we first went to do that coastal survey I mentioned earlier, we set out in our little rubber boat and we went about 50 miles down the coast, and we got to a place where the ice was shore fast. So the Arctic ice was touching the land. And we had to sit there for 3 days waiting for it to melt. And this is August, right? This was in 2006, I think. People would ask me when I'd come back, well, are you seeing impacts of global climate change? And in those years, the early 2000s, we would say, well, we expect those things to take decades and to become visible, on a longer time scale. It's not something you'd see from year to year. When we finished that survey at the same spot 6 years later, the ice was 225 miles offshore. And more than anything else, that dramatized for me the kind of change that we're seeing in the Arctic and the rate of change, which is just unprecedented. It's so big a change that, for example, that summer there was a large storm, and when the ice is shore fast, the wind can blow over it all at once and no waves form. It's ice. As it gets to be normally, 100 yards, 200 yards, maybe a quarter of a mile offshore, the wind blows really hard and you get little waves. That year there were 12-foot waves crashing directly into the Arctic tundra. And it was so unexpected that the native people who lived there had never seen anything like it. And they were so unprepared that one family lost their lives because they were out on a barrier island fishing, as they do in the summer. There's a very short window where they can get out, and fish is a big part of their diet. So they're out on this barrier island thinking it's August, everything's fine, and the storm came up and the family was lost. And it was a very sad event for the local community, and completely unprecedented in their cultural history. Nobody drowns. It just had never happened. So it gave me a sense of what's at risk as climate changes so quickly in the Arctic. Of course, it's happening twice as fast there as everywhere else. The reason is very simple. It's like most climate change science, it's not complicated. The sunlight that hits white ice and snow mostly bounces off. The sunlight that hits dark rocks and water mostly gets absorbed. So as you melt a little bit of the Arctic, it sucks up more heat and it melts a little bit more of the Arctic, and it sucks up more heat and melts a little more of the Arctic. It's very straightforward and very simple, but really profound in its impacts. So the polar bears are running out of ice, coming ashore, mostly hanging out and waiting for the ice to form. And as you come across a polar bear, the thing you most want to do is not surprise it. They don't take well to being surprised. Most of the ones we came across, we were lucky enough to see a little bit ahead of us in the fog, but as we were doing those surveys in the fog, you could sometimes see 20 feet in front of your face. And we were moving very close, very carefully when we were doing that. The grizzlies, on the other hand, I think are much more threatening. So on one of those coastal surveys, we came across a grizzly bear that I think probably had a kill just over the hill. It's the only explanation I can think of. There were 3 men in a boat standing up with a 50 horsepower engine running, and the grizzly bear charged our boat, which is just unheard of. Most grizzlies in the Arctic see one person and run away. This bear decided it was coming for us. So we whirred off down the river in our boat as fast as our little boat could go. He swam back to shore and ran faster than our boat could go down the river and swam at us again. And Steve, the biologist for the refuge who was there, was just dumbfounded. We'd never seen anything like that. So we shot a little cracker shell right in front of the grizzly. It went bang, as they're supposed to do. And he kind of was like, well, I'm really not very impressed, but I guess I'll stop swimming after you. And he eventually went back to shore. But it really got my attention. And I'll just close by telling you about my first grizzly encounter. When we left, that bear was charging up the hill at me, and I had the same thought that I probably shouldn't be in the Arctic. My next thought was, a cracker shell goes about 100 yards, and they had been very careful to train us not to shoot it behind the bear. You can imagine why that's a bad idea, right? So as the bear's running as fast as they can go, they can do about 35 miles an hour, which you really can't imagine until you see it. He seemed really far away, and then he was really not far away. So I had time to think, he's too close for me to fire this cracker shell. So I ejected the shell, and as I made that noise, he crossed the barrier that we had been told, you shoot a grizzly that's charging you at 30 yards. That's the rule. That's what you're supposed to do. the last thing I wanted to do was shoot a grizzly bear in a wildlife refuge in my first year in the Arctic. So I was determined that I was going to face down the bear, and the hardest part is not to run away. We like to think of ourselves as brave people, right? Seeing this thing barreling at you, it took every ounce of fortitude I had to not just run away. But I stood my ground. As I racked the shell, I think he heard me, and he stopped at 30 feet. I measured it afterwards. Came screeching to a halt, stood up, did what bears do. What's that? Figured out I was a person and turned and ran away. And that's what you would like your grizzly encounter to be like. And every other bear besides the one I just told you about, the first time it realized we were humans, it would turn and run away. The native people hunt them, so they have a healthy fear of humans. This bear ran so far that I saw it disappear over the horizon, which is about 6 miles away. So you can imagine my heart rate at this point, having faced down my first grizzly. I turned to go back to surveying, and I flushed a ptarmigan, which, as it comes out of its nest, goes blah, 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 blah. And I basically levitated off the tundra. I don't think my heart rate's ever really calmed down from that one. But it was a good story to tell when I got back to camp that night. So I hope that you've learned a little bit about how remarkable shorebirds are, and I hope especially that the next time you're out around here and you see a tiny little semi-palmated sandpiper in a wetland around Vermont, it makes you think now, this could be a juvenile bird that's never been to Vermont, and it's finding its way to French Guiana. The bird that I showed you the track of actually flew over my hometown in southern Vermont. I grew up in Shaftesbury, and it was really exciting to me to see that even though that bird didn't stop, it flew directly over. And Jason mentioned earlier that this time of year, that miracle is happening. The birds are on their way back north. Soon they'll be getting back to the Arctic, setting up nests and doing what they do, hopefully reproducing successfully and sending another generation off. So I hope if you see some of them on their way, you think about the remarkable journey that they've been on. Thanks very much.
So how do you account for the 80% decline? You think it's mostly wintering grounds? And what's happening down there?
There's no definitive answer, I'm sorry to say. There are some things we know, and one of them is that, like the spoon-billed sandpipers in China, people in Suriname eat semi-palmated sandpipers. It's not a subsistence hunt, it's a sport hunt. So if you're a young man in Suriname and you have a shotgun, it's a nice thing to do to go out on the beach, shoot a bunch of semi-palmated sandpipers, and have a nice barbecue. It's illegal, but it's very common. And so Fish and Wildlife Service has been leading a program to try to build conservation efforts. There's no, in the United States, we have a very well-established and well-regulated hunting system. So there are bag limits and licenses and all kinds of requirements and training that's required. And there's nothing like that now in places like Suriname. So they're working to try to build that culture so that there's an understanding that there's a limit. That's what limits are for, right? There's a limit to how many you can take and not deplete the population. We don't know the population level effect of that take because we don't know how big it is. There's a lot of work that needs to be done to find out how many birds are being taken. But we think it's significant enough to be playing a role. Beyond that, those birds go through all of these areas that have lost coastal wetlands on their migration south. So you can imagine the bird that got to Long Island didn't find a lot to eat as it comes down through some of the other critical areas like Delaware Bay. There's a lot of issues in Delaware Bay related to the horseshoe crab industry, and semi-palmated sandpipers are just like red knots, a much more famous shorebird that concentrates in Delaware Bay. But they eat the eggs of horseshoe crabs, which come ashore, lay their eggs, and go back. And as they nest in very large numbers, the horseshoe crab eggs get disturbed and come up to the surface, and the birds come along and gorge on them. They're great little packets of energy because the birds, remember, have just come all the way from South America And suddenly there's this great resource, easy to catch and easy to eat, easy to digest, which is important because they actually reduce the size of their digestive system as part of getting ready to fly. So their stomach gets smaller, and these little tiny horseshoe crab eggs are a wonderful food. They're declining dramatically in Delaware Bay because of the impact of overfishing. And they're taken for bait primarily. They're used in the medical industry, and they take horseshoe crabs and remove some of their blood, which is, if you've ever had anything injected into you, an IV bag, any kind of medical fluid, those are all tested with horseshoe crab blood. And the reason is it has a very primitive but very potent immune system. So if there's any kind of contaminant in whatever it is they're testing, it clumps together, and it shows you that's bad. Don't inject that into somebody. It will make them very sick. So it's an important part, it's an important medical industry. They try to bleed them and set them free. There's not really good data on how many of those survive. But between that and the bigger impact from the extraction of horseshoe crabs to be used as bait, we think that's a big hit to semi-palmated sandpipers because they use that resource just like the red knots do. It's very hard to say which of those is playing the biggest role, but they're all things that people are working on to try to understand.
What's the latest on how the birds geolocate?
Yeah, how do the birds know where to go, right? So I'm not an expert in that field, but the things we know about have been known for quite some time. I'm not sure there's anything that you knew that you don't already know, but just basically, we think some of it comes pre-programmed. It's called an endogenous program. So it's something like, say you got your cell phone, and if you type in some numbers, it already knows how to make a call, right? You didn't have to program it to turn your numbers into sounds and send them across the. It's kind of like that with a bird. It comes with some kind of pre-programmed sense. I mean, otherwise, how would they ever know to leave the Arctic, right? So they have some sense of how far to go and what direction to fly in, but it's unclear how. Then they have a variety of tools. They can, in some sense, they can see the magnetic field of the Earth. There's a connection between the receptors that actually are sensitive to magnetic field and they're the part of their brain that processes their vision. So it's something like they can see a magnetic field, which is fascinating. We can't do that. They can also use the sun, and not like the Geo Locator, which knows whether the sun's up, but they can tell direction from the sun. And so putting together all these clues, we also think that, especially in the case of shorebirds, there's a lot of learning involved. So if you take an adult shorebird in the Arctic and track it with a geolocator, it's likely to do things like that flight I showed you where it gets to New Jersey and then it just flies to French Guiana. Well, how could it possibly know French Guiana is there? Well, it's been there before. So the adult birds that have made that journey take more direct routes, which causes us to think they kind of know where they're going. The juveniles also tend to stop more. So if you track a juvenile bird, and we're just starting to do some of this work with whimbrels because we know very little about juvenile birds and how they survive, but also how they get to where they're going. So juvenile birds are much more apt to stop and refuel and rest and also kind of feel their way, right? So we're doing some of this work on Cape Cod where some of the juvenile birds come, the adults just mostly overfly it. There's no reason to stop there, they're headed south. So we think there's important learning involved as they kind of start to feel their way through the hemisphere. But yes?
You were saying how there would be 2 nests in a square kilometer. I was wondering if you're developing any kind of an infrared gadget to try to sense that.
I've been curious about that for quite a few years, especially as you stumble around the tundra looking for these things. So the experts I've talked to have said, first, birds are such efficient insulators that if they're incubating the nest, there will be no signature. And that's kind of what you'd think, right? Because they're in the Arctic, it's June, but it's snowing on them, right? So here they are, they're making eggs out of the remnant of their body fat and the little bit of spiders and other early emerging insects that they can catch. So they're in this amazing metabolic stress, and then they're staying warm on top of all that. So they couldn't do that if they weren't very efficiently insulated. And feathers are amazing insulation. Anybody who's ever had an eider down quilt knows how warm that can be. So the eggs are very warm, but the bird covers up that signature. Otherwise, it would just gradually freeze to death. If they get off the nest, then I think there's some hope that the right kind of infrared sensor could help you find it. You'd still have to be very close, but it's a really good question and something I'm really curious to try to look into more, because often what you do is you flush a bird and you know it's somewhere within 30 feet of you, but finding the 2-inch size nest in a 30-foot or sometimes 30-yard circle is really challenging. So maybe there's a future for that idea.
How about one easy to answer, riveting question that keeps us up all night thinking?
Go ahead. I have an easy one, I think. I know the geolocators are tiny, but the birds are pretty small. And how does the addition of that on the bird use up energy or some of their calories they need to fly 30?
That's a very good question. And the question is just, what's the impact of the geolocator on the bird making this enormous journey? So as these units became smaller, nobody knew, right? So when we put them on semi-palmated sandpipers, that had never been done. So we made a point of studying the impact. And it turns out that for something as small as a semi-palmated sandpiper, there is a measurable impact. So we compare them to birds carrying just the leg flag. It's hard. What you'd really like to compare it to is a bird that nobody's touched or captured and has no marking on it, right? But how would you ever know what becomes of that bird? So the next best thing is a leg flag, which is small and light and much less of an impact. So compared to those, you can measure a slight decrease in return rate in semi-palmated sandpipers. We didn't find the same thing in larger shorebirds. So it looks like the geolocator is still heavy enough that if you're a tiny bird, there's some impact of carrying it. And we went into the study.
Flying up in the ocean and they can't swim and they just, they've used up all their energy carrying that.
It could be, or it could be that there's some other impact on survivorship just from carrying the thing around. So we went into that study with our eyes open, thinking we may impact 5 or 10 birds by doing this. At the same time, we've lost 1 million birds to this decline that nobody knew anything about, and we thought it's important enough to know where are they going, what's happening to them when they get there, and we're now starting to use those data on the wintering grounds to try to prioritize conservation sites. So we felt like it was a worthwhile trade-off to impact some birds, and it looks like as units get smaller, the impact will go away. So that's what we expect.
How about we thank Dr. Brown from Manamit again? Thank you, that's great. And obviously there's a lot of people here tonight, so many that there's 20 people in the hallway. This is about 25 people more than we usually come. So many people I had to spend the night in the bar during the talk. And thank you. I know folks came all the way from Rutland tonight to be here. And obviously people came to see me. And to my fans on the internet, ni hao, xie, and hola, and gracias por todo. Again, it may be that we're starting to outlive this space a little bit. This is getting to be tough. Yeah, I know I've received a number of email inquiries about our use of this here. If you have a post and beam barn that comfortably sits 65 people, that's locally located, and an open bar and bathroom space, come talk to me, seriously. And are you a scientist? Are you a storyteller? I am always looking for more passionate Suds and Science speakers for next season. We have one more talk of the year, next month in May. Dr. Laura Ogden from Dartmouth is going to speak about her research studying the invasion of North American beeters in Tierra del Fuego and the changes, incredible changes they've had on the ecosystem in South America, being introduced there. That's our last talk of the season, then we pick up next November. So again, if you have that barn that's 70 people comfortably, if you know dynamic science speaker you think would be great, please come talk to me afterwards. I'm sure Stephen would stick around for a few minutes, answer a few more questions. Thank you, Adam, again. Thank you all for coming, folks.